about the trust domain. So much that we actually have these weird hacks of like the trust domain not always actually really meaning the trust domain they literally put, because normally they don't actually care. So my proposal is quite simple. It's just to add a field per service account. So if I want to say this service account is allowed to access my service, I just write the service account. Technically, it's still slightly complex because we do need to have a namespace on the service account. So I was proposing to make the format namespace/service account. But other than that, I think this will greatly simplify things. And it's easy as an implementation standpoint because we can just translate service account into this internally. We just don't make users do that for themselves. So yeah, basically just wanted to bring it here to get feedback if anyone had suggestions or didn't like it or anything like that. Has anyone else experienced pain dealing with this?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what you said. I've seen some users really struggle with this, and when I was like first getting started, I was like, "What the heck do they want me to do?" So I think it makes sense from my perspective, at least.
Okay, I'll probably go clean up the PR. I just need to have like more documentation and validation testing stuff. But then I'll push that forward.
So this wouldn't remove the principals field just for backwards compatibility purposes.
Oh yeah, definitely keep it, and it's still actually useful. Like in theory, you can have a custom spiffy identity. Like it's not really fully supported, but maybe you could. So this is just adding an easier way to do it. And in our documentation, we'd probably want to go do a sweep and move over to the simpler version for most cases. But yeah, definitely not removing anything.
So then for cases where you do want specific trust domain usage, you would just stay with the existing field?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, an ideal API, like I would love to have one field that could contain either trust domain qualified principal or a service account. But given that I don't think we can make that change in a backwards compatible way, I guess it makes sense. I know that the Gamma team had been working on some proposals for auth APIs. Do we know how this would map in that space?
I don't think they've really done any. I've never even seen an example of a prototype of a first draft.
we have not had a first draft. A handful of us, so me, Rob Scott, and Shane at least, are planning to meet at KubeCon, and you're obviously welcome to join. I'll link the note stock for plenty of meetings like that. But there's a handful of folks that are finally talking about auth policy. Whether it lands in Gateway API or is under NetPol or something like that is kind of to be determined. But we're actually going to concretely talk about the first draft of this at KubeCon. But I would not hold up any of these changes waiting on that.
Sounds good.
Yeah,
thanks.
like what I would do, Mitch, if I was designing like the API from scratch, would be like from source, and then it would be like some structured thing like namespace X if you just care about the namespace, SA bar if you care about namespace and service count, and PD foo or whatever. But right now we just don't have that format from in the API, so we're kind of stuck with just adding, like that's why we have to do the NS/SA instead of just putting like a composite field kind of thing. But I think we can live with that.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Does it make sense to just go to a composite field anyway instead of using the slash? And that way, if we want to eventually grow it and maybe deprecate the old way, we have a way forward instead of like, oh, let's do a third one.
Maybe I just worry it's just so different from all the other ones. And we also like we have the when fields where it's like the conditions where that kind of inherently is a little flat. I guess it doesn't necessarily have to be flat, but it's, I don't know. Wait. I would be very confused if like users were setting like, it would really be like, you have to add all these lists as well. And it's like identity or namespace. I don't know. Like it's, I would be, this introduces some different confusions, given that we're not like starting from scratch.
Yep. Yeah, I started writing this out as a comment yesterday and then was like, oh, wait, this is actually going to be real verbose and possibly lead to more foot guns. But since you brought it up, I figured maybe people have
and actually people like wouldn't, they wouldn't write like this. They'd write it like this. Like, this is hard to see, but like, if someone's going to understand like all these indentations and like important dashes to be lists, like this gets you all the time. So I'm just a little worried about making it more complex there.
I think it might be at least a good exercise as we consider the API, though. As a rule of thumb, a good idea is to first consider what would the ideal API look like, and then sort of work backwards to understand what the limitations of our current API are and why maybe we can't quite get to the ideal just yet. So I think it's worth exploring. I know lists in YAML can be frustrating in terms of you missed a space, etc. But I mean, I don't think we can avoid the use of structured lists overall. We've got them plenty of other places in the API.
Yeah, it's not so much like the structured list. Like if I was designing the structured list, it just, I don't know, like having the same way to represent the same concept, because I don't know. I've always favored aligning with the past decisions, even if they're not the best, than making new decisions out of fear that the next time we go out of field, someone else comes and they have different opinions, and now we end up with like 8 different people's opinions on how APIs should look, and there's no cohesion. Like at least today in authorization policy, every field is a list of strings, which is in many ways dumb. Like ports is a list of strings as well. That really should be a list of integers at the very least, but it's at the very least consistent across all the fields. So
I mean, one point in favor of the existing principles string is that it feels at least a bit less ambiguous than the structured list as far as meaning. Does inclusion of a namespace, and not the rest, like what does that mean? There are a couple of ways to interpret that, so it's at least less ambiguous.
all right, I'm trying to take notes. We talked a bit about alternative ideas, and me and Ian said we considered them but didn't like them. Is that how everyone feels, or should we do something more with this alternative idea?
I'm in favor of this. We can workshop the specific APIs, but in general, yeah, directionally makes sense.
Okay, I am going to move forward with updating the PR to be actually ready to be approved, and then ping more people to actually go review the details.
Do you think we'd also benefit from just adding more documentation on what a principal should be set to, or what trust domain means?
I don't think it would hurt for sure, but it's still, I think both. Like I think we should do both, really. Like if you look at the thing where we don't even make trust domain literally mean the trust domain, Like that's a big smell that no one cares about trust domain usually. And even we document a lot of things that people don't read. So I think I saw Keith tweet something about if you I don't know, people read the docs once they don't understand it, not when they're trying to understand it usually. So I've never been confused about what a field that says service account means in pod or whatever, because it's just straightforward.
Agree. Sounds good.
Okay, let's. All right, Jeremy, you're up next. Are you here? Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Want me to share this talk or?
Yeah, I can share or you can share it. I think it'll be pretty quick. It's a continuation from the last meeting. Essentially like trying to boil the ocean by suggesting like doing all of Envoy best practices, but I think it makes sense not to go through that whole list and try to integrate that into Istio. So I think it was suggested to go like come back with like a more refined, narrowly scoped RC, and I think that maybe a configurable overload manager would still make sense to potentially like have an API for, or at the very least maybe have some configurable values in the Bootstrap. Yeah, so I put like the same kind of links, and a lot of the confusion that I saw around the Envoy best practices were actually around also like the overload manager stuff. But yeah, so I wanted people to like be aware of this doc, take time to look at it, or provide any feedback if they have any. But I think this is an opportunity for like a better user experience for that, and it seems like low-hanging fruit that I don't think could or has potential to break anything, but I may be wrong and I don't have the full context, so open to any feedback in that regard. You muted, John.
Thanks. Yeah, so it seems like there's two proposals really, having a values.yaml and a new API. Was there one that you were pushing for? Or?
Yeah, I'm leaning towards option 2. I think actually that's name wrong. I updated the name for it, but I think having the API might make more sense. But maybe it's a lot of work. I don't know. I haven't added a new API to Istio before, so.
Yeah, one question I have: if we went with the Bootstrap override approach, which we already have bits of, like we have this complexity to add it. I think that's for gateways because they don't have the full support for the annotation or whatever.
Okay.
Like sidecars are probably just an annotation, I believe, if I remember right. Like, what if we just made this part easy, like either a values setting in the gateway that's like custom override config map equals X, or something like that, or just made the annotation work, and then you can already set annotations. Like, is that also a potential option? Like, then it's pretty much the same with config. It's just whether you put this blob in the values.yaml or in the config map, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. I can consider that. If you can leave that as a comment, and I can mull over it longer.
Okay. Yeah. The other thing, I forget the exact how it passes through all the flow, so I may be slightly off in the details. The other thing though is on this option 2 we already have an API that basically does this, which is proxy config, but it's very, very small. And the reason it's small is because it's supposed to be the stable parts of the proxy config map, which has a bunch more stuff. So I'd be hesitant about adding all this low-level stuff into our API. Like generally, my feeling on the Bootstrap, or sorry, the Overload Manager is that it's a really, really, like everything else in Envoy, it's a really poor API for humans, right? So if we want to expose break class down to Bootstrap and make that easier, like that's fine. That's why I was kind of saying like, hey, maybe let's just do the existing Bootstrap override and make it slightly easier to use. But pulling this all up into a first-class stable API in Istio, like, this is kind of not, like, no one wants to write max heap, like no one wants to do this, right? This is not an API that a human would just choose to make for a human to write. So I'd be a bit worried about pulling all of that up. It's also a giant API as well. So we have like the existing proxy config. There's like 2 or 3 fields, and then we'd be adding like 50 fields here for this new use case that is useful to solve, but I don't know that it's useful enough to take on that much complexity. Yeah, Keith.
I'm just wondering, does it make sense to go the extra step and abstract it more into more like a virtual service type of thing? I agree that this is not a super ergonomic, Overload Manager is not a super ergonomic API. Does it make sense to create an abstraction on top of Overload Manager and make it better? Like, don't make the unit bytes as an example, or do some t-shirt sizing, only support certain actions. Because I think the use case for the Ingress Gateway, it feels like one of those things that's very important for folks running Envoy as an edge gateway in production that Istio historically just hasn't exposed, or maybe even thought that much about. So I'm just wondering, does it make sense for like I don't even know what you would call it, but would that be compelling to you? More compelling?
It would make it more compelling to put in the API, but I don't know that it's necessarily a better option. If that makes sense. Like if we decided it was a good option, it would push toward the option 2 for sure, in my mind. I'm just a bit worried about, like, there's always the trade-off between making our own abstractions that are simpler versus actually letting users do what they need to do. So I see Overload Manager, and maybe that's just because we haven't had an API, but it's this advanced niche thing. Like, it's almost like Envoy Filter, right? Like 99% of users aren't going to care to set this, and the 1% that are going to not want to use our abstractions because they want fine-grained and to put all their own opinions. I don't know that's true. Like, it's hard to say because that's the only option to do it today, is like to be in that 1% that's willing to put up with the complexity. So I could be wrong for sure.
Related to that, John, actually, I was wondering if you did have the context around why it was removed, like the Envoy filter option in 1.21. It seems like Bootstrap's the only way. I'm just wondering if you had context on why that's the case now. Was it because of that? Like, people wanted more fine-tuned access to Envoy and didn't really care for the Envoy filter abstraction?
Quats here, you could probably answer that.
And because there are multiple ways to do the same thing. I mean, there's at least like 3 different ways to change Bootstrap. And the method that used XDS would introduce latency to startup. So it's a worse way of doing the same thing.
Yeah, it's very complex too. So
I guess for me, the central question is, how big is the population of users who will want to set these things for an Ingress gateway that aren't going to want to or know how to write Envoy Bootstrap config? And I guess for me, I can somewhat easily imagine users who would rather, try to shrink the heap of the gateway, or start rejecting certain connections, if the memory gets above a certain limit, things like that. And those users might not want to learn how to write all the details of the Envoy Bootstrap config. I think that's just where maybe more research needs to be done. I know of at least one use case internally where we've got folks who aren't, I'll say that the most sophisticated Envoy users, like they're scared off by Envoy filter, but they want to be able to control this a little bit better. They'd almost rather there be like kills or traffic shedding or things like that at the edge, as opposed to just having Envoy and runaway memory due to, in their case, there's listener filters. Listener filters taking a bunch of time and holding on to buffers and such. So that's at least one that I know of. I don't know if folks here know of others, but the question as far as the persona and what folks want to do versus what they're willing to write seems to get a central question to me. Is that a fair summary of what you're saying, John?
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess next steps, I could consider that other option, look into it a little more. But in the meantime, if people like have async feedback they want to provide or more context on different things that they want to add, feel free to comment.
Okay. Anything else on this before we move on to the last item?
Nope, that's all. Thank you.
Also, if anyone has more items to add, please add them so we make sure we allocate some time. All right, William, it looks like you're here, right?
Yep, I'm here.
Welcome.
Hello. I guess what I'm proposing in this document is to in the sidecar like server TLS settings to like support that while also supporting existing MTLS rules. The TLDR and how this would be implemented would be to just duplicate use the same logic for constructing like the user TLS filter chain and add that in addition to the existing like filter chain. And like the motivation for this feature is we're on the progress of like migrating towards like Istio auth Z rules, and we'd like a mechanism to like gradually roll this out. Like for example, like auditing those rules before like flipping entirely to Istio auth Z rules.
So right now, do you have your clients sending not Istio TLS, and then they're going to switch to using Istio TLS, and you want to kind of do that seamlessly without having to change the port or the server side or anything like that?
Yeah. In addition, like I think this diagram is misleading. Like many of these clients are actually like not even like on the mesh yet, so like they don't have a sidecar deployed yet. So the idea is like first get them like with a sidecar and use like existing. Well, actually switch over to MTLS, but like don't really do auth Z roles. Like all the auth Z roles are going to be like audited, and then gradually, like once all clients have migrated towards have onboarded onto the mesh, like flip over to only using Istio auth Z roles.
So to clarify, you want your auth Z to only actually validate when there's Istio MTLS, but you want to audit if it's regular one-way TLS, or maybe even MTLS. Is that correct?
I guess for now, like for the auth Z side, we would like to start out like with not having it. We just would like to like only have MTLS like like auth N and not worry about auth Z at the beginning as we like roll this out, because like we have we have an existing auth Z approach that most services use. But then but like one of our motivations for switching to Istio is that like our auth Z approach is inferior to what Istio supports. So like eventually once everything like is migrated to the mesh, which would take like a year or two, then we can start like enabling Istio Auth roles. And like the reason why like we'd like this feature is that we can like take advantage of like other Istio like features that such as like local rate limiting or like destination rule changes that without like having Auth in the initially.
One thing I just want to clarify. So are you using the Istio sidecar resource with this mode to terminate TLS on the sidecars, or is the application terminating TLS?
We're currently just pass-throughing, but we'd like to prototype. We'd like to transition to the sidecar, like terminating TLS. Yeah,
I see. Because if you're not using the sidecar to terminate TLS, it should already work today, right?
Yeah, it does work today. I think the problem is that like the sidecar will, like the other features of Istio, such as like, for us injecting envoy filters for like.
Oh, that's right. Because then you can't do the HTTP stuff.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So when we had done this original design doc, I mean, this had come up, like, should we support mixed? And we've had a lot of, I mean, you've probably seen, I think you looked at the code already. It's pretty complex. We've had a lot of issues with it in the past. So the idea was that we'll just keep it simple for now, because what we expected is that if users did need this, they could just use different ports, and potentially even just externally facing ports, but they can still forward them to the same port on the application. So the clients would need to change potentially, but the server doesn't necessarily need to. Like they can use the same one. But I can see why, that could be problematic. That's pushing complexity from the project onto the users. I was just curious if that's something that's potentially viable, given that your clients are already changing from sending TLS to sending MTLS as they onboard to the mesh. Is that something that's also possible to change the service or port that they call?
That is one of our approaches. I think like one thing about like doing that is that I'm not sure about like the strain it would have on the service discovery side, since our service, like that would essentially be like doubling the amount of endpoints our service discovery mechanism uses. But I think like that's our like worst case scenario. Like I think it is like something that's being like played around with, but like of the two approaches, I think we'd prefer this one. I think at least that's what I'm pushing for, like this approach, but we haven't really like fully like evaluated the other approach of like just using two different like ports.
Got it. So if I'm correct, I haven't looked at the matching code in a while, because I value my sanity. Today, with permissive, we generate something like this, basically. And what we're saying is basically, we actually already generate this, right?
So this is what I'm proposing. I think it generates everything except for like the middle block. So like the top block would be like for the MTLS, and the bottom block would be for the pass-through plaintext. And I think I'm missing one filter chain where there's like a pass-through TLS where it's just like the second block, except it's missing the port.
Yeah. I guess it depends also if the port is HTTP or TCP. So
yeah.
Yeah, I think this is probably reasonable. I mean, we're already doing stuff like this, just not when we're terminating TLS. We have these types of matches in some cases. I don't really see too much that can go wrong.
I think in addition, like I think even the proposal like prior like is gated but behind the environment variable, and
it still is. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's probably best that it always is. So
yeah. So today, how does it work again? Do you have to set strict mode? Is that the case?
You have to set disable mode. So as in like.
So this example is maybe outdated then.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So if they still have disable, it works like today. Now you can set permissive mode. If you set strict mode, it like overwrites this or something. It means it has to be MTLS.
Yeah. I didn't. Okay. want to like think about like the
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Yeah, I think this makes sense. One thing I want to consider as well is we have, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but we have the new MTLS protocol that we call HPhone used with ambient. And what that looks like is instead of in one listener like stacking all these and guessing, or not guessing, but detecting which one to use, we actually have two different phases. So it's kind of like the inner phase and then the HPhone phase. That actually makes this easier. Like it actually might already work out of the box in this case. We should probably test it. Because it decouples the application TLS phase and the mesh TLS layer. So this is kind of aligned with that in some sense. We should just make sure when we're doing this, maybe we also add some testing for that mode, and I can help you out with that or do it as well. Even we probably get lacking some tests even outside of usage of this mode. So. Yeah.
I definitely think like I should evaluate HBone. I think we'll eventually probably transition to something to it. I don't think we're gonna be transitioning to ambient very soon, but I do believe HBone is still supported in the sidecar mode. Is that correct?
Yeah, technically there's no coupling to ambient. It's just we only turn it on ambient mode because we don't want to introduce risk for sidecar users when it's not really required for sidecars. But in theory, it could be used. So I actually probably could, in theory, solve this today. But I can still see the value in solving this for the non-HBone mode, given that we're not anywhere near pushing sidecars to use ambient as the default. I was talking about any other opinions on this. I'll take some notes on what I said as well. All right. Since I saw some PRs fly by when I was out of office. Are those ready to go? And you're kind of just waiting on review of the idea and then the PRs ready to go, or?
I think there needs to be like a lot more tests for it, but at least
Okay.
like, the logic is done. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try and take a look soon.
Yeah. Feel free to like let me know what needs to be tested, and I can like dig into.
Yep. Yeah, I can definitely point you to some tests that can be extended and things like that. Cool. Anything else on this topic or on any topics, since this is the last topic of the agenda? All right, then we can wrap it up. And if anyone is attending the ambient meeting in 20 minutes, we can have some more discussions there. Looks like there's 2 topics on the agenda there. So if you have anything else, maybe add it before the meeting. And yeah, we can go from there. Cool. Thanks, everyone.